Can you study the Old Testament the same way you study the New? Welcome to Bible on the Go with Dr. Dan. You know, the Bible is a rich treasure of truth that we call God's Word. And these two major sections, a lot of people know there's the Old Testament and the New, but what's kind of a pretty carefully ignored secret, I guess you might call it, is can you actually study the Old Testament the same way you study the New? Well, in one sense, yes, because you got to read them, right? In that sense, absolutely. You got to think about what you're reading, no doubt. But there is where it becomes different because the Old Testament has features about it that's quite different from the New. Let's start with the Old Testament. For one, it takes at least 4,000 years of time for all the events described in the Old Testament to take place. 4 millennia! That's a long time. Of course, the whole Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and Hebrew doesn't even have vowels. Okay, thanks to the Masoretes, they put vowels in there to help people that learn Hebrew. But Hebrew is a really difficult language, and you read the characters right to left, for example. But one of the big things about it is there's so many different cultures that interface with the Old Testament. There's the Sumerian culture down in southern Mesopotamia. On the other side of the Fertile Crescent is the long-standing and historic Egyptian culture. There's the culture of the Hebrews after they leave Egypt and the nation of Israel under Saul, David, and Solomon. And then over by the coast is a completely different culture called the Philistines that like to start, have wars with Israel and such. I mean, it's all through the Old Testament. Then there's over in northern Mesopotamia, the Grand Assyrian Empire and its distinctive material culture, followed by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II. And that's from southern Mesopotamia as they took over the Assyrians. And then the final one, at least as the Old Testament comes to the close, is the Persian kingdom. All those cultures are different from each other, and they affect how you interpret, because especially to go so far back in time, for example, with Abraham to the Sumerian culture, that was really something compared to the United Monarchy of Saul and David, for example. But there's also differences in technology in the Old Testament. There's the world before the fall and what they had in terms of their culture. There's the world after the fall of man as everything was changed and now the world wasn't perfect anymore and man had to work on his own and grow crops and all of that, make laws and things. And there's Abraham over in Ur beginning to travel and the law codes that he was familiar with compared to the law code of Moses that would occur 500 years after Abraham. Well, there's all those other law codes too, right? Lipit, Ishnar, and Ishnuna, for example, not to mention Hammurabi. Okay? Well, then there's the catastrophic flood, of course, that covered the whole world with Noah, right? And then southern Mesopotamia and all the things that were discovered during that time period. And then Egypt as it affected all the other cultures on the international stage through its long line of pharaohs. That's a lot of distinct things in the Old Testament relative to background that affect its interpretation. But compare it to the New Testament, it's drastic. For one, there's only one culture, Greco-Roman, and the Romans were in charge. There was only one language. It was universal. It was the Greek language that followed everywhere the Roman Empire went. And of course, Greek had vowels. Hey, okay. So, no doubt in Ephesians, when it says in the fullness of time, Christ came. But the whole New Testament takes place in 90 years. Not 100, not 4,000 like the Old Testament, just 90. So the New Testament's easier to read, easier to study because it's a lot more modern. And there's not so many things to think about. But in the Old, if you do the work and you understand what's being said, you'll find the Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi a tremendous blessing as you study both the Old Testament and the New Testament with care and understanding the times in which it was written, the culture in which it was written, with the technology in which it was written. Thanks for watching Bible on the Go with Dr. Dan. If you like these videos, the best thing you can do is hit that button called subscribe. It doesn't cost a thing, and you only have to do it once. Praise God.